Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum. On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, Alex Bozich and I are joined by our friend Stu Jackson from thehoosier.com to talk about Indiana's NIT loss to Wichita State, and then to reflect on this odd and disappointing and bewildering season and, kind of start taking our first peeks forward. It's going to be a long offseason, kind of talk about that and what to look forward to for next season, as Indiana is going to be looking to break a 3-year NCAA tournament drought. And speaking of the NCAA tournament, obviously there are no more Indiana games to get tickets for, but there are still plenty of great NCAA tournament games to get tickets for, especially if you live near any of the regional sites like Louisville, like Kansas City. And if you want to get tickets to those games, SeatGeek is definitely the place to go. They have great prices on tickets to all of the Sweet 16 games. And, the thing about SeatGeek, and the reason why I like them so much and why I feel so comfortable recommending them to you, is they really are a customer-first company. They have over 50,000 five-star reviews in the App Store, and they've gotten those reviews because they're focused on making your experience buying tickets as easy as possible. They pull in millions of tickets from all over the web. They rate each deal on a scale of 1 to 10 and display them on an interactive seat map. And what all of that means is that it's really simple for you to find what you're looking for. Green dots are good deals, red dots are overpriced, so you know at a glance, kind of where you're going to get the best value for your money. Plus, every purchase is fully guaranteed, so you can shop for tickets with confidence. And that, whenever you're buying something online, when you can have confidence in the person that you're buying it from, that is extraordinarily helpful. I have the SeatGeek app on my phone. I use it when I'm looking to buy tickets to concerts, to sporting events, whatever it is. SeatGeek is definitely the place that I use, and that's why I recommend them to you. And best of all, our listeners get $10 off of your first SeatGeek purchase. So use the promo code BRINK, and you will get $10 off your first purchase. You can use that for concert tickets, for sports tickets, comedy tickets, whatever it is. Promo code BRINK for $10 off your first purchase. All right, now here's our conversation with Stu Jackson. All right, well, I'm here with Alex Bozich and Stu Jackson, who covers Indiana basketball for thehoosier.com. Gentlemen, this long and strange and at times bewildering season is over as the Hoosiers lost in the quarterfinal last night, of course, to Wichita State. We'll spend some time kind of reflecting on the season and looking ahead to the offseason, but let's just talk real quick about that Wichita State game that we just saw. And Stu, I'll start with you. What were your general impressions of the game, being there inside of Simon Skjodt Assembly Hall and seeing the Hoosier season come to an end?
It was a pretty competitive effort, I thought, from Indiana. I think more than maybe I had expected initially coming in, just because, I kind of gave Wichita State a little bit more credit than I think maybe other people were when you consider how well they were playing on the road and, in general, just the turnaround they had late in the season that allowed them to win. I think it was something like 13 of their last 16 heading into last night's game. And I was really impressed by Marcus McDuffie too. I thought Justin Smith did everything he could, but that's just a guy that, no matter who you match him up against, you're going to have a tough time defending him or covering him. And Indiana did well to, limit him for the first, 4 minutes or so. But then after that first media timeout, he really just took over and did enough to really give his team some confidence. And Indiana, it's kind of the same issues that we've seen all season with, just an inability to consistently knock down a perimeter shot or, even the struggles from the free throw line that effectively kill any chance they had at a comeback or their ability to rally in a meaningful way.
Yeah. Alex, we were just talking before we went live about You know how kind of odd some of the stats were when you consider Wichita State's strengths and weaknesses coming in. You know, we expect Indiana to struggle from three, but Wichita State has not been a good shooting team. They make 11 3-pointers. They also dominate Indiana from the free throw line, making more free throws than Indiana attempted. Certainly, if you had told me that was going to happen before the game, you know, I would have assumed a Wichita State victory. And Indiana just didn't have enough to be able to compensate for losing out big in those two areas.
Yeah, with the NIT, though, in particular, I think sometimes you can throw out some of the numbers from the standpoint of, you know, a lot of it comes down to who really wants to move on. And I'm not saying that Indiana didn't want to move on or play any more games, but from the opening tip, what I saw last night, particularly when you look at the block shots that Wichita State had in the first half, 8, they were the more aggressive team. They were the more physical team, and the officiating was, you know, they were letting them play, and that favored Wichita State in many ways. And obviously, the 3-pointers are not something you can plan for. But not only did McDuffie hit the 4 threes, I think Dexter Dennis, who's a freshman, I think hit 5 of 7, which is not something you really expect to happen either. So the fact that Wichita State was more aggressive, I thought, really on both ends, and they hit 3-pointers. I mean, usually the more aggressive team is going to be rewarded by getting to the free throw line more often, and that's, I think, what we saw last night. So credit to Wichita State. You don't win 3 games on the road in the NIT if you're not playing well. I feel like in many ways it's a program that I think the last time they missed the NCAA tournament prior to this year was 2011. They have obviously some experience in McDuffie. They have a really good coach in Greg Marshall. And, you know, next season, I think we're going to be talking about them as a team that's probably going to be making it back to the NCAA tournament. They have a lot of solid pieces to build around. And so it's not in any ways, a terrible loss. A game Indiana on paper should have won, but I think the better team won just based on the disposition in terms of how Wichita State came out and approached the game. They outplayed Indiana.
Yeah, they did. It's one of those things, like, I thought Indiana played hard, but I thought Wichita State played with more of a sense of urgency. You know, and you said aggressiveness is probably 2 ways of saying the same thing, but there just seemed, it's hard to, you're not inside of people's minds and inside their hearts, so it's hard to say that they necessarily wanted the game more. And I certainly think a guy like Juwan Morgan, played with a big sense of urgency last night, given that it was his final game. But it just seemed like, Wichita State maybe had an extra gear that Indiana just wasn't able to get to. And, ultimately it ended the Hoosier season. It's interesting, Stu, you look at how Wichita State's season went, and they were a young team and also a team, really trying to fit in a lot of new guys. I think you look at the Ken Pom minutes continuity metric, and they were like 345th. I mean, they had almost nobody back from last year, who had played minutes. And their season kind of went how I thought Indiana's would a little bit, where you really struggle early, but then they really, hit another gear and have, raised their Ken Pom ratings by 75, 80 spots, something like that in the last couple of months. And, they were able to do it. Indiana, while the Hoosiers did, win 6 out of 8 late and certainly got better than they were during that, stretch where they lost 12 out of 13, never seemed to take the big leap late in the season that maybe we thought that they could. To what do you attribute that as we start to look for reasons why this season maybe didn't go as well as we thought it would? Because Indiana certainly got better, but a team like Wichita State seemed to hit like 2 or 3 gears more and to be more consistent with it. Of course, they dug themselves so big of a hole they didn't make the NCAA tournament. But, as we look at Indiana, what do you think prevented the Hoosiers from hitting their stride as we thought they would, maybe a little bit earlier, and then carrying that momentum all the way through the end of the season?
Well, I'm sure people are going to be yelling at me or tweeting at me for, using injuries as a reason and saying it's just an excuse. But I mean, the fact is, when you look at how well this team was playing in December, and then what happened after Rob Finney got his concussion around mid-December, I believe that was the Central Arkansas game, and just, how their, play kind of dropped off after that, and just all the different things they were dealing with in January with, Deron Davis being sidelined with an ankle injury for most of January after the Illinois game. And then Devontae Green, at the tail end of that month as well. That was when he had his 3-game suspension. Just a confluence of those factors, I feel like, basically contributed to this team failing to reach its potential and I guess carry the momentum it had from such strong performances in non-conference play. They did do well, obviously, by closing out the regular season with a 4-game win streak. And I think a lot of people thought that put them in a good position to feel confident about maybe taking care of business against Ohio State in the Big Ten tournament, which obviously that turned out not to be the case. But really, that's the thing that I keep pointing back to is just the fact that they could never really, like, at the most critical point in the season, I felt like the return of Big Ten play, chemistry was just the chemistry was just fractured just because of the injuries and the inability for this team to have, a full assortment of players available or a full roster available when it really needed it most. They obviously dealt with injuries early in the season, and when you look at Race Thompson and what he went through with his concussion and things like that, and of course, I don't think anybody expected, could see what happened to Jerome Hunter coming, but really that's what I keep going back to is just the fact that this team not being at full strength couldn't. That was basically what prevented it from reaching its full potential, I thought.
Yeah, I think Stu raises a lot of great points there. The thing I would say more than anything else, and it's something I wrote about in 5 Takeaways today, something that Archie Miller talked about last night, was just the inability to shoot from the perimeter with any consistency. It was a problem all season. And I think that, to me, is the biggest. That was something I focused on last night in the locker room, talking to different guys a lot. Just, basically the question was, is this something do you feel like can be developed within the program, or is this something where they need to go out and get guys? And a lot of guys admitted that maybe it's a combination of both. But, I think in today's game of college basketball, if you can't shoot at least an average percentage from behind the 3-point line, if you're not going to be elite everywhere else, you're really not going to have a chance to win games with any consistency. And this year's team, you look at the guys that took the most 3-pointers. I think Romeo, Langford, and Juwan Morgan were right up there in terms of attempts, and neither one of them shot the ball very well from the perimeter. Devontae Green obviously was, his late season surge there helped his numbers, but they just don't have any guys on this roster that can make shots with any consistency. And I think one of the themes that as you go back and kind of replay some of the moments of the season where that were critical, like the Purdue game at home that they lost, there's a lot of games that were 1 or 2 possessions. And you look back at those games, you say there was opportunities in those games where they could maybe push the lead out from 2 or 3 to 6 or 7 or to 7 to 10. And they could just never hit that shot that they needed to hit with any consistency to kind of give themselves some breathing room. And I think that's why they ultimately never got over the hump. Now, the injuries are obviously a factor in it, but, it's at some point of the season, late at least, they did have a relatively healthy roster. The Ohio State game is an example where they just couldn't really make the plays necessary to get over the hump.
So hold that thought on shooting, because I want to talk a little bit more about that as we start looking ahead to the offseason. Before we get to that, though, today's episode of Podcast on the Brink brought to you by our friends at Home Field at homefieldapparel.com. You will find the comfiest and most unique licensed IU apparel that is available anywhere. Home Field was started by an IU grad, and all Home Field apparel is designed and printed out of Indianapolis. And now that it's March, late in March, Home Field has got you covered for tournament season. Find your favorite vintage IU basketball apparel from Home Field. And hey, even though the Hoosiers aren't playing anymore, wear it proudly as a signal that you believe better days are ahead. And they have a lot of new items there, too. So if you've been to homefieldapparel.com before but haven't been in the last few weeks, they've now got the Tri-Blend T-shirt with the Bison logo. It's the T-shirt version of the hoodie that we've been talking about a lot this season. They have the Script Indiana logo as a hoodie now, and they have a sweatshirt version of the Hoosiers Shoes logo. So all the great vintage IU designs that you know and love, and now on some different materials, different shirts. So check them out and see if any of those are right for you or the IU fan in your life. And don't forget to use the promo code BRINK at checkout for 15% off your first order at homefieldapparel.com. That is BRINK at checkout for 15% off at homefieldapparel.com. Home Field, wear one for the team. So as we start looking toward this offseason, Alex, I think, what you mentioned was a kind of a great jumping off point to that. And it was really interesting hearing, some of the guys' answers to the questions that you asked about shooting. And I'll start with you on this, Alex. What do you think are the biggest questions that need to get answered this offseason? And I don't mean like, will Devontae Green be consistent? Because that's something that we won't know the answer to until next season. But this offseason, what are some questions that need to get answered for this program? I have to think that the first is, where is some shooting going to come from, either as another recruit in the class of 2019 or as a grad transfer? Is it fair to say that that's probably the biggest and most urgent question that needs to be answered?
Yeah, I think it's question 1, 2, 3, however many deep you want to go. That's how critical it is. You look at the 3-point shooting percentage in Big Ten play. At one point, and they obviously helped themselves with the hot streak late. But at one point, you remember, Jerod, I was kind of tracking if they were going to be the worst 3-point shooting team for a Big Ten team in conference play in the Ken Palm era. That's not territory that you want to be in. That's not territory that you're going to make the NCAA tournament being in. They got out of there. I think they finished 27.5%, which is still, it's
dreadful. It's dreadful.
There's no sugarcoating it. So that to me is the number one question. The second question to me is, Devontae Green and Deron Davis, are they going to, Deron talked last night a lot about how JD Campbell, the SID at IU, told him that, if they don't make the tournament next year or whatever, they could be the first 4-year class since I don't know when to not make the NCAA tournament at IU. What do those two guys want their final season in Bloomington to be? How are they going to, lead a change of some kind, whether that be what they do this summer, whether that be how they lead? Obviously, Devontae had an up and down season with being suspended. And I think that more than anything else, the shooting is important, but where does the leadership come from? Because you're losing a guy in Juwan Morgan who had been through a lot of different situations, who had kind of really raised the level of his game these last 2 years. Is there anybody in that locker room that's going to be able to assume that role, whether it be one guy or by committee? To me, that's a significant question, because even if you do improve the shooting, if you don't have great leadership, if you don't have guys in the locker room who are willing to kind of impose their culture on the rest of the guys, I don't think you're set up very well for success.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. Those are the most urgent questions. Stu, what do you have to add to those? And are there any other questions that you think can actually, we can actually kind of look for answers for this offseason?
Yeah, I guess mine would be just, where is the size going to come from? And that may seem like a strange question when you consider that, you've got, a 6'8", Race Thompson, and a 6'8" Jake Forrester, and a 6'10" Clifton Moore on the roster, and, Trace Jackson Davis, who's in that range coming in. But what seemed to bother Indiana a lot, especially in Big Ten play, and I think part of this was because, again, Deron Davis wasn't healthy for a significant stretch of that, so Indiana couldn't match up as well defensively against some of those guys, or offensively. But it was a big toll for Juwan personally to be playing at the 5, as the guy who's, largely undersized for that position, even though he's 6'8", 232. Most of the, top tier Big Ten teams this season had guys like, a Matt Harms or a Nick Ward, who, were big and physical and could kind of set the tone in the paint for their respective teams. And, Indiana, when they, sort of dealt with that or got hit with that kind of that proverbial punch, didn't really have any way to answer that, especially if Deron wasn't healthy. And so I just feel like they need another body like Deron, or I guess that just has to come from, guys developing in the weight room this offseason, over the summer, for them to kind of better match up with that and to be able to be more physical with some of these teams. Because, again, when Juwan's forced to play extended minutes at the 5, and, when Deron, at points in the season isn't quite, able to play, 20 or 25 minutes in a game, it puts a lot of stress on him to, one, carry the load in the paint, but also just, avoid foul trouble as much as possible, which, obviously he had a hard time doing at times this year.
Yeah. You allude to that with your question and Alex with the shooting. Just overall, there's a lot of questions about the roster. It's college basketball, so you kind of have, I think we've all come to expect transfers out and transfers in, and so there's no use really speculating on, who that might be. So we'll just kind of wait and see, but it's just kind of a thing that happens now in college basketball. So, who stays, who goes, if anybody, who comes in, we'll have to see that. The other thing, and I don't know if this is a question that we'll get an answer to this offseason, but I'm curious if what you guys think of it, if you have any insight on it. Jerome Hunter is a piece that would have been so important this season and didn't play, and we know how talented he is, but we also know that he has this leg condition that is kind of mysterious, and we don't really know what's going on with it. Stu, do you get any indication that we'll know this offseason if he's ready to go for next year, or is this a thing that is going to linger into the season and we won't really know until practices start and if he's out there kind of going full contact and ready to go? Do you think we'll get any insight on it during the offseason?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're going to learn anything, that the next official update at least probably won't come until if IU is doing the annual event at Huber's again in Borden, Indiana, in late May. But yeah, just from what I gather, it just seems like this is something that we probably won't know until closer to practice this fall, whether he's going to be able to be in a position where he can return. Now, I'm not saying that that it's like a concern, or that he may never play again, or I'm not making any official declaration on that. It's just really it is very much kind of a wait and see approach to just see how how he responds to treatment and things like that. I think Archie Miller said on his radio show at one point this year that Jerome was taking some sort of medication for his lower leg condition, and he had returned to practice at one point, not live action, but just being able to do some individual work and some light shooting. And you even saw videos of that, on Instagram and Twitter and things like that. So, but that said, I still think, we won't know anything definitively until May at the earliest, but most likely closer to, when practices start up again in the fall.
Yeah. And I think another thing to watch in this situation is just, does Indiana try to recruit anybody at that position? If all of a sudden they're bringing in a 6'7" wing this offseason, I would wonder, 6'7", 6'8" guy that can play the 3-4. I would wonder if that would tell us anything about what they are thinking in terms of the future of Jerome Hunter. Now, I'm not saying it would be a closed book at that point, but I think that's something that bears watching, because if in the event that he's not going to be able to play, which again, I'm not saying that this is the case, but I'm also saying that the coaching staff isn't going to want to be left with, a major hole on the roster. So I think that bears watching for sure. But, I agree with what Stu said. I mean, there's no reason at this point. What's the update going to be? They don't know, obviously, right now. They're not going to talk. Archie probably won't talk again, I wouldn't think, until at least Huber's. And then, we may not even hear anything definitive at that point. So it could be into the fall. But the one thing I would watch is just in terms of the roster construction. If they're going to bring somebody else in that kind of does some of the same things as Jerome Hunter, then that might make me scratch my head and wonder what his status is going forward.
Well, speaking of 6'7", 6'8" wings, there has been a little bit of chatter that, Indiana may have a chance again with Trendon Watford. A lot of people have been talking about this. I know I just, kind of didn't really think about it much, even though he kept Indiana in his final 4 or 5. Do either of you guys have insight on that recruitment and whether Indiana is really back into it? Is this something fans should really be paying close attention to, or does this still seem like something that is, much more of an extreme long shot? Stu, do you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. Yeah. So Indiana is back in the mix with his recruitment. Had some of our readers asking about this on our site, at least. why are they just now getting back in? What was the deal with the last month? Well, Keon Brooks was, the priority, as I'm sure everybody who, follows, our site or, inside the hall or even your updates, Jerod on Twitter. I mean, that was the top name, for IU, until, Brooks made his decision to commit to Kentucky, obviously. And so with that out of the way, this is kind of that's how, Trendon Watford is back in the picture, basically. There's a chance that, with the NIT being over, that, IU might be able to get an in-home visit with him. But the thing you have to keep in mind is, he played for an AAU team that used to be run by current Memphis assistant coach Mike Miller. And so Memphis has a really good relationship right now, and they're in a really good position in his recruitment. Duke being Duke, they're involved as well, and obviously they can't be counted out. I would say that Indiana's probably on even footing right now with LSU and Alabama, just because although they've been, I think, invested in recruiting Trendon longer, Alabama just fired Avery Johnson, and LSU has some uncertainty surrounding their coaching situation as well, with everything going on with Will Wade. And so it's Indiana has some ground to make up, I would say, just because, he's looking at, Trendon said at the McDonald's All-American game that he's targeting the Jordan Brand Classic, which is April 20th, I believe, for a decision date. So, that gives them about just under a month to try to make an impression and that sort of thing. So we'll see where it goes, but that's just kind of the gist of where things stand right now, and sort of, how IU is back in the picture there.
So not a time to hold your breath, certainly, but just kind of maybe keep one eye on it and see if anything develops. Certainly if a visit happens, then it would seem more serious. But at least something to keep an eye on.
Yep.
So I want to talk with you guys about the players who are departing. I think you look at Evan Fitzner, in terms of legacies that these guys leave, only here for 1 year, didn't really play enough, have enough big moments to really leave a legacy like a guy like Max Bielfeldt did. Zach McRoberts, I think he has a pretty uncomplicated legacy at Indiana, a guy who came in for 3 years, played with extraordinary heart, played hard defensively, was, a big part of Archie, instilling a new defensive culture in. And I thought it was a fitting end for him in the Wichita State game that, he played 19 minutes, he didn't score, but he was the only player who played, more than 2 minutes who had a positive plus minus on the game, which is just a very Zach McRoberts thing to have happen. But you talk about Romeo and Juwan, and their legacies are a little bit more complicated. So Alex, I'll start with you, and let's start with Juwan. Obviously, statistically, put up some of the best numbers that the school has seen, being in the top 25 in points, top 10 in blocks, top 10 in rebounds. Had some great moments. We kind of watched him grow from his freshman year, being a guy who really emerged in the second half of the year and dealt with injuries, to being a leading man, the last 2 years, and just being the rock that this program was built on for 2 seasons. What is the legacy that he lives at Indiana? Because, given all of that, his last 3 years, Indiana doesn't make the NCAA tournament as well. And as we know, legacies at Indiana are often, for the top players, are tied up in how much you won. But I think everyone would also admit that going through coaching change and being on some very imperfect rosters, you can't necessarily pin that on him. So what do you think the legacy is that Juwan Morgan leaves on Indiana?
I think he'll just really be remembered more than anything else as the guy that kept grinding and never gave up or quit on, in a culture now of college basketball where if something goes wrong or you're being asked to do something that maybe you're not comfortable with in terms of position, or, there's a coaching change or any other variety of things that can happen where you can just transfer and go somewhere else. Juwan Morgan stuck it out in Bloomington. He got better. As you mentioned, he didn't maybe win at the level that some of the other really good players that have come through the program did, but more than anything else, he was, the last 2 years, really the rock that, or I don't know the best way to describe it, but he was the glue that held Indiana together. I mean, without him, the last 2 seasons would have been, not that either of them were horrible, but they would have been even worse without his production. And so I think he's going to be a guy that most fans remember as someone that showed up every game, played hard, gave it his all, got the most out of his talent, improved. And more than anything else, if the program is able to kind of get back to where the fan base hopes it'll be under Archie Miller, they'll remember these years as kind of the early transition and him being one of the leaders during that time. So, there's nothing really negative to say about Juwan Morgan as a basketball player or as a person. I've never really heard anybody say a bad word about him off the court. Just a good guy to be around, someone that his teammates really like being around. If you had a roster full of Juwan Morgans, I think you would take your chances to be a successful team in the program.
Stu, how will you remember the career of Juwan Morgan?
I think Alex covered it pretty well. Just a guy that had one of the more impressive work ethics that I've seen in my admittedly short time, covering the team on a full-time basis. But he could have very easily just mailed it in, I guess, given how this season was going at certain points, but he still had this attitude that I'm still going to make something out of it, and even though IU didn't make the NCAA tournament, it's still playing postseason basketball, still getting the chance to play 3 more games in Assembly Hall. I don't think it's any accident that the attitude, at least that I think you and I saw in the locker room and a lot of these post game media sessions, Alex, was we're here and we're going to make the most of it. I think that was a direct influence of just Juwan and his attitude, not only in the last month, but I think just throughout his entire career here. So just somebody who was, again, a foundational piece during a transitional time, and I think somebody that Archie Miller is especially grateful for in terms of just being somebody that he could look to kind of lead by example and those sorts of things.
What about Romeo, Alex? I mean, obviously, his legacy as an Indiana high school basketball player is, almost unparalleled. Very few guys have done what he did. And he comes to Indiana, there's great enthusiasm, and he delivers one of the most impressive, certainly statistically, one of the most impressive freshman seasons in school history. And yet, the team doesn't win to the level that was expected. And, I think to some fans who had, expectations of him being an all, first team all Big Ten level player and potential All-American right out of the gate, were disappointed by, him not being able to live up to those expectations. And you can certainly debate whether those expectations were warranted in the first place and all of that. But at the end of the day, given the body of work of what he accomplished as a Hoosier, and of course the expectation that he'll be going on to the NBA next year, what is the legacy that he leaves in his one season?
Yeah, it's obviously different from Morgan because Morgan went through a lot more, played 4 years, but in many ways, I think that he should be appreciated as well because he came to Indiana at a time where obviously it wasn't the greatest situation. He could have gone anywhere he wanted to in the country, but and played a significant role right away. But he opted to come to Bloomington, and the season obviously didn't go as planned. I just hope that people don't focus too much on the fact that he didn't play these last 3 games, and remember the fact that he played 34 games before that? How many? 32 games. 32 games before that. Played the most minutes out of anybody on the roster. Took a lot of punishment this season, especially in the Big Ten. He was getting bodied up by just about every defense, and he's another kid that I think when you step back and take a look at just kind of what kind of person he is on and off the court, he's someone that should be appreciated. You look around the country, there's a lot of guys who go pro and bail on their teams and don't don't show up anymore. But I don't think that's Romeo at all. I think it was, the circumstances of this postseason weren't the greatest in terms of him being a little bit banged up, and the fact that it's the NIT. It's hard to really get, if you have a potential to go pro after this year, it's really hard to maybe step in and say, I'm going to risk my future to play in the NIT. So, I would choose to remember the fact that he came to Bloomington at a time when, like I said, there was no guarantee that he was going to make the tournament. He didn't make the tournament, but I think most fans will be appreciative of the fact that he came and gave it his all for his 1 year that he was there.
Stu, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say I think, some fans are probably frustrated because they thought, Indiana is adding this, nationally renowned player, top player in the state, this 5-star kid, and it's going to, fix a lot of the issues where from the season before, where, IU needed a go-to scorer and someone who could kind of create their own offense. And ultimately, I think, the frustrations of not making the tournament, kind of what Alex talked about, or maybe, it negatively influencing, I think, some fans' opinions of Romeo and just the legacy and the impact he has on this program. Beyond that, I would just say, him signing with Indiana and joining the program to begin with is something that, at least for Archie Miller, is going to be, looked at, or will forever be looked at as a huge recruiting win, and something that sent a message that, any other Big Ten programs, or even some other programs outside of the conference that, traditionally come in and recruit the state of Indiana, are going to have a hard time getting some of these guys, because, Indiana, again, sent this message that, they're here and they're going to do everything they can to get these guys and try to kind of lock down the state's borders, so to speak. So that's, I guess, really what I'll, remember the most for his legacy, is just the fact that, he created this big opportunity for IU to really make a name for itself again and be relevant to a lot of the top prospects in the state, and in most cases, kids who are, nationally ranked.
So as we look forward, with Juwan and Romeo leaving, obviously there is a huge void in production. I mean, those two guys took a ton of shots, played a ton of minutes, and new players are going to have to step into those roles. But, one of the things that we've learned, and this is true at really all levels of sports, is the importance of internal leadership. Not necessarily just who's going out and producing on the court, but who are your leaders off the court and through the offseason, like whose team is it? And so we touched on this a little bit earlier, talking about Devontae and Jerod. And I think in college sports, you automatically, or you by default, look to your seniors as the guys that are supposed to step up and be the leaders. But Stu, I think as IU fans look at those two guys, and as hopeful as we are for Devontae and Jerod, and as exciting as Devontae's recent stretch has been, and it looks like a light switch is flicked on, and we hope that Jerod can enjoy a healthy offseason and get himself in the best shape possible and be ready to play a bigger role. Those are not necessarily guys that you automatically look at as, yeah, that's where the leadership is going to come from. We're hopeful, but there's question marks there. So whose team is this now? Like, do you think it is their team and they will take that mantle and run with it? Do you see an underclassman, perhaps an Al Durham or a Rob Finney or somebody else, having the kind of personality and strength of will to step into that role without being a senior? Because I think that's a big question that's going to need to be answered for the future of the program. How do you look at that, here on March 27th as we start to look into the offseason?
Yeah, I would say it can be a combination of both. Where you have Green and Davis being, kind of the go-to guys, but then also you have another guy like Al who can, kind of join that as well. His attitude, especially in Big Ten play when things weren't going well and just toward the end of the season, I thought was really impressive, just because he seemed like he kind of embodied the same attitude that Juwan did. I felt like, where, he didn't want to give up, and he just wanted to do everything he could to, put IU in the best position possible down the stretch. And, So I think he has the makings of a guy who could, alongside Juwan and Devontae, kind of step into that leadership role. I think you could also look at a guy like Justin Smith too. I think there's enough there in terms of just as far as him having the confidence to be in that kind of position with, how much trust that Archie showed in him with some of the defensive assignments he gave him this year and things like that. I could see, those 3 or 4 guys kind of being in the mix there.
Alex, how do you assess the leadership for Indiana moving forward?
I mean, outside of the shooting, I think it's my biggest question because Deron Davis has never been fully healthy for a full season. I feel like if you're going to be a leader on the team, now I'm not saying you have to, but I think you got to be at least one of the 4 or 5 best players, most important, reliable players on the roster. He's shown that he can do that at times, but he's never shown it for a full season. Devontae Green was suspended this year for 3 games. And although he did play well to close out the season, I still think the jury's a little bit out on in terms of him being able to do it consistently for a full season. So I would look more towards Al Durham and Rob Finney as 2 guys that really have to step up. Now, I'm not saying that they're going to step out of line and say, hey, Devontae and Deron, you haven't done anything to earn kind of the leadership role in this team. I think it can be a committee thing, but Durham and Finney are going to be important players for next season. They're both guards. I think both of those guys really need to step up and take on just kind of a, whether it be vocal, whether it be lead by example. I just don't see, there's not a Juwan Morgan on this team in terms of even you could even see with Romeo how much he respected Juwan. Romeo's the most talented player on this year's team, but you could see how much he respected Juwan throughout the season. And I don't know that there's a guy on this roster that everyone's just going to look at and say, this is our guy. So to me, it's going to have to be a by committee approach.
So, I listened to all of this and we talk about some leadership questions, and we talk about the void in production now with Romeo and Juwan being gone and not necessarily seeing a whole lot of shooting on the roster yet where that's immediately going to get filled. And this seems like year 3 is shaping up to be a very challenging one for Archie Miller, and he's 4 games over 500 at Indiana. He's 4 games overall. He's 4 games under 500 in Big Ten play, Stu. And obviously he's, dealt with the challenge of, taking over a program that was built offense first and switching it to defense. And this year didn't go as anybody expected. But he's missed the NCAA tournament twice now. That's 3 years in a row for Indiana. Year 3 is a big year. Not to say that he's necessarily on the hot seat for year 3, but I think, years 3, 4, 5 of a coach's tenure, all the built-in excuses of give this guy time and all of these things, they start to go away and the pressure starts to get more real. So as you look ahead to this next season for Archie and some of these challenges that he's going to be dealing with, what do you think are maybe some of the things he needs to change or do differently, or that will be the biggest challenges for him trying to navigate this 3rd season?
I think it just kind of going back to the comment Alex made about not having a Juwan Morgan on next year's roster where it's, you have the one player who's kind of the, by default leader, that everybody on the roster respects. I think, kind of navigating that committee approach from a leadership standpoint is probably going to be his most difficult challenge. And, just figuring out, which guys are going to respond to that. I think, you saw at times throughout the year when he was pretty tough on guys like, Justin and Devontae, especially, they didn't always take very well to that criticism, during timeouts or during breaks in games or when they got subbed out. Not saying that was the case the entire season, but, there were times where, that was noticeable. And I'm sure Alex would say the same from, where the vantage point he has from, press row inside Assembly Hall. So, really just, I guess, just the challenges of, okay, how is he going to be able to manage? How is he going to manage all these guys without kind of having an extension of himself on the court with a guy like not having a guy like Juwan on the roster?
Alex, how do you view it?
Well, I think the further you get into a tenure of a coach, a lot of the things that you mentioned, the built-in, I don't want to say excuses, but kind of the challenges become, they're not really taken into consideration by the fan base. And one thing I think that the challenge going to next season is you're losing so much production from this team, and the expectation, I think, next year. This year the expectation was to make the tournament. They didn't make it. I think next year the expectation is probably still going to be to make the tournament, because this, next year would be year 4 of, 3 under Archie of not making it, with kind of what you're seeing around the country with some of these coaching moves. And I'm not saying this would happen at Indiana, and I'm not saying that Archie's would be on the hot seat, but I think you have to show progress. And this year they made it to the NIT. Progress from the NIT, to me, is making the NCAA tournament. So they're going to have to, in my mind, figure out a way to make that happen. I'm not saying that it would be warranted to make a change after next season if that doesn't happen, and I don't think that will happen. But I think the challenge is, figuring out how to replace this production that's lost, figuring out how to make this a better shooting team. And I think one thing that will be in Indiana's favor next year is I don't think the Big Ten is going to be the monster that it was this year. There's a lot of teams that are still going to be pretty good, but there's a lot of teams also that are going to be losing a significant amount of production. So we'll see, but it's not a great situation by any means, because part of the problem with getting Romeo is that getting him kind of raise the bar for what people thought this year was going to be. And then when you don't hit that bar, people are disappointed. And now they're going to look at next season and say, hey, you don't have Romeo, you don't have Juwan. Let's see what you can do with basically this whole team of players that you brought in. So I think it's going to be a different kind of pressure on Archie Miller. The thing about Archie is I don't think he's really going to feel anything from, like with Crean. You could tell that certain things that were said or written about him really got under his skin, and he took it to heart and worried about it. I don't think Archie's ever going to really care what's said or written about him. I think he's just going to go to work every day and do his job. But I definitely do think the pressure on him next year is going to be at a higher level, and we'll see how it turns out. Maybe having a different mix of players and just a kind of a reset on things will lead to a different result next year.
Well, we can all exhale. It was a long season. There were obviously some highs. I mean, the way the season started and some of the wins Indiana had and beating Michigan State twice. I mean, there were, Stu, some exciting moments. But I think, and we all would have loved to see, Indiana from a fan perspective, obviously make it to New York and, have a chance to win the NIT. But I think it's, sometimes after seasons like this, it does feel a little bit exhausting, and I think it'll be nice to take a little break. But boy, the offseason is going to feel long, I think, because there's so many questions and so much riding on year 3, it feels like. But, we won't start getting those answers till the game starts. So kind of final question, Stu, just your maybe enduring memory of this season. Obviously the season overall was a disappointment, but as you look back on, is there an enduring memory that will pop out, and is that one of a loss or one of the big victories that Indiana had?
I would just say it's more of a theme maybe than a win or a loss, a specific win or loss, but just kind of the slow starts that Indiana made a habit of, and whereas in December they were able to actually rally and make comebacks in the second half and had that ability, but as Big Ten play rolled around and as the competition got even tougher, for whatever reason they lost that edge, especially that stretch where it was losing 12 of 13. That to me will really kind of stand out. I know that's not really a happy note to end on, but it just felt like, that it really was kind of what that was something else that sort of kept Indiana from kind of realizing its potential this year. And, I guess it's something that will always sort of stick out to me when I, discuss this season with anybody.
Well, Stu, as always, thanks for joining us. You can reach Stu's work at thehoosier.com. What kind of stuff will you guys have coming up this offseason? What kind of coverage?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting with how the NCAA is choosing to handle the recruiting camps and tournaments and things like that. And so eventually we'll be on the road covering those kinds of events. And I'm pretty sure either Nike or Adidas is returning to Indianapolis, but in May. So events like that will be on the ground covering, and of course you'll have the Indiana All-Stars later in June as well. So a lot to look forward to, just as far as recruiting and the summer circuit and things like that. That'll be the bulk of our coverage.
And definitely, if you haven't subscribed to their podcast, Heard on the Hoosier, definitely do that too for additional IU basketball podcast content. Alex, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I'm actually going to turn this around on you for a second. Ask you a quick question. What are your, because you approach this a little bit different than Stu and I in terms of, your kind of approach to covering the team is not someone that's on press row, not someone that's in the interviews asking questions. What are your expectations for next season? And I know it's early, and we don't know the roster, but what do you need to see next season to feel like the program is trending in the right direction?
Make the NCAA tournament, I think that's the simple answer, and I think it's the fair answer. I think every season is different, and every season can have its own context. And so if you have 3 guys that you lose to injuries, like there are ways that you could not make the tournament and it could be okay, and you could still show some growth. But given just the normal flow of a season, and like, for example, I would say it was fair to expect this year's team to make the NCAA tournament, even with all the injuries and all the things that went wrong. This team's still disappointed by not making the NCAA tournament because you were a win or 2 away from doing it. And those wins were available. They were there. Even as poor a shooting team as you had, there were ways for that to happen. And so even with all the questions that we have about next year, I think, this is Indiana. And, 4 straight years of making the NCAA tournament, that's not acceptable and shouldn't be. And I think there are enough pieces here and pieces coming in that we already know for the 2019 recruiting class, and pieces available, out in the grad transfer market and the other transfer market, that you can put together an NCAA tournament team. I'm not saying you got to be a 4 seed or, anything like that, but I think it's fair to expect Indiana to make the NCAA tournament and feel disappointed with anything less than that. And I think the program itself has to get back to the point where that is the standard. And I think it's on solid enough footing that should be the standard. So that's what I'll be expecting going into next season. And I think it's a perfectly fair expectation given, the players that are on the roster and hopefully what other players they can bring in. But that's what I think. And I think that's where the program needs to be.
Well said.
So, and as you said earlier, it's progress. Making the NIT isn't what anybody wanted to do this year, but it was a step forward from last year. Not as big as it could have been, not as big as it should have been, but it was at least progress. And when you're a number 1 seed in the NIT, that means you just missed. So the only way to really progress is now you got to get in the tournament. And I think it's fair to expect Indiana to get there. Easy for me to say from 1,000 miles away, but that's what I'll enter next season believing.
And Jerod, we'll still be here, I think, for the most part, every week during the off season. There may be some times with vacation this off season where we maybe miss a week or so, but we'll still plan to be here. We're hoping to maybe do some interviews with former players or different angles, because I know everyone doesn't want to hear us breaking down the ways to improve shooting technique for the next 6 months. So we'll try to mix it up, but obviously keep it tuned here, and we'll try to keep you entertained throughout the off season.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody who has listened throughout the entire season. Stu, thank you for your time, and we'll talk to you next week on another episode of Podcast on the Brink. Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com, and visit Alex over at InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.